Good morning, everybody, and welcome to this latest event by the EU-UK Forum on European Security Challenges. For those of you who don't know, the EU-UK Forum has been set up post-Brexit to provide constructive and informed dialogue on matters affecting the UK and its European neighbours. And if you want more information, you can go to the website eu-ukforum.com. My name is Michael Peel. I am the European diplomatic correspondent of the Financial Times based in Brussels. And we're very lucky to have here today Sir Julian King, who for many of you will need no introduction. But for those who may be less aware of his career, Sir Julian has a long career in British and EU diplomacy. He has worked in Brussels, New York, Luxembourg, The Hague, Lisbon, Ireland. He's been the ambassador there and was ambassador to Paris before coming to Brussels as the UK's last ever European Commissioner between 2016 and 2019, when he had the Security Union portfolio and covered a range of security questions from terrorism to disinformation, cybersecurity, and many others. So welcome, Sir Julian. Thank you for joining us today.
No, good morning. Good to be here.
And I wondered if we could start, perhaps we have a very broad brief here on European security challenges. For obvious and good reasons, a lot of the focus in those frenetic weeks before the end of the transition period was on trade, and security got a bit less coverage. But now, obviously, it's coming more to the fore, and people are starting to ask questions about what the future relationship will look like. And clearly, it's immensely important to both sides. These can literally be matters of life and death, as well as of geopolitical strategy in terms of how both the EU and the UK relate to other world powers. So I wondered if you'd like to just spend a couple of minutes giving some big picture thoughts on some of those questions and how they relate to European security challenges post-Brexit.
Sure, it's a good place to start. Can I just very quickly say that I'm very glad to be here because I very much support the forum. I think it is very important that we have opportunities to talk about this relationship. Wherever you come from in your views on the issues, the fact is the UK and the EU are going to continue to be neighbours. And we need to talk about that relationship, how it's going to work. Some people might want it to simply go away, but that's not going to happen. We can't simply turn our backs on each other. We do have to work out what we're going to do together and how we're going to do it. And that's true in the security area as much as any other areas you've just said. So on the security questions, very briefly, what happened, what have we got, and what's going to happen next? Well, what happened is that we went on a bit of a journey in the process from 2016 onwards. If you remember, we had Prime Minister May at the Munich Security Conference in early 2018, talking with some passion about the importance of security cooperation, including with the EU. She was saying things like Europe's security is Britain's security. And she made an unconditional commitment to maintaining that kind of security cooperation. Even as we got to the political declaration signed by Prime Minister Johnson, we were still talking about establishing a broad, comprehensive security partnership. Pretty quickly after that, it became clear that the Johnson government meant by that that they didn't want to have structured or organized cooperation on foreign policy and international security issues. They were ready to sign up to cooperation on what's sometimes called internal security, so tackling terrorism, serious and organized crime, cyber challenges. But there, they didn't want any ECJ involvement. They didn't want any EU laws in the security field, as in other fields. And they didn't want to be told how to protect fundamental rights. They were willing to say, of course, that they respected fundamental rights, but they didn't want to be told how that was going to be put into practice. So they put some constraints around the nature of cooperation on those internal security issues, which we might talk about a little bit more. But we did get an agreement on internal security cooperation. And I think it's worth underlining that because it wasn't always a given. Again, we can talk about that a little bit more if you like. And it is massively preferable that there is an agreement on that cooperation, because the alternative of no agreement would have had really quite radical consequences. What's going to happen next? Well, on the internal security side, I think that the nature of that cooperation as part of the overall agreement depends a little bit on what happens in some of the next steps in managing the agreement and the relationship that sets out. So there are going to be implementation issues. There are some outstanding issues, particularly around data adequacy that's very relevant to cooperation on security. There are going to be questions of divergence across the relationship as a whole, which may or may not impinge on security cooperation as well. And there is, as you know, provision for a plethora of reviews and other way stations in the relationship, which I think could reflect on the security cooperation as well. And when it comes to foreign policy and international security cooperation, well, the UK has made clear that it wants to proceed on a sort of ad hoc, bilateral, small groupings basis. It's been very clear that its priorities for the next period include presidency of the G7, joint presidency of the big climate COP meeting at the end of the year. And it's around those pillars, those events, that it wants to build its network of cooperation on foreign policy challenges. And I think that's great. I think that's very important. It is going to pose some challenges for cooperation with the EU and EU member states, because whether you like it or not, some people do, some people don't. Over the recent years, the European Union has developed a role as a security actor. It is challenged sometimes, particularly in its neighborhood, around what you might call traditional foreign policy and security questions, whether that is looking at Russia in the east or looking to the southern neighborhood. But at the same time, on a whole range of what you might sometimes call new security challenges, terrorism, cyber, hybrid, health security, it has sought to work together. And the member states have invested in the EU as a platform for organizing their security activities. And so the UK is going to have to deal with that. More security work being done by the 27 in an EU framework, and more EU policies impinging on security matters. Policies to do with technology and data, for example, which go right to the heart of some of the security challenges. And of course, the EU is there. The EU is going to be sitting at the table in the G7, and the EU is a crucial part of the international efforts to deal with the climate issues that come to the COP meeting. So there's no escaping working with the EU as well as with EU member states on some of those foreign policy and international security challenges.
So that seems a very good jumping off point, Julian, because that takes us onto a story which is very live at the moment, which is the UK decision not to give the EU envoy in London the same diplomatic status as national ambassadors. And obviously member states are very unhappy about this. And indeed, there's news this morning that the Charles Michel's team have not been willing to arrange a meeting with the UK, the new UK ambassador, Lindsay Appleby, which seems to be a retaliation for this. So, I mean, leaving aside the kind of diplomatic tit for tat, in a way, this example seems a great microcosm of what we're talking about, because in one sense, the UK is exercising sovereignty. It is saying that the EU is an international organization and not a sovereign state, which is self-evidently true in a narrow sense. But the UK is now in a unique position where it's the only one of 143 countries where the EU has missions that doesn't give the EU a similar recognition to the nation state ambassadors. Do you think that shows perhaps a tendency in London to a self-defeating tendency to view the world as they would like it to be rather than the world as it is? And are they going to have to change that approach?
Well, I know some people think this sort of Ambassador-gate story is a bit of a storm in a teacup, but I would say this, wouldn't I? Déformation professionnelle, as they say in Brussels. I spent quite a lot of my time as a diplomat and some time as an ambassador. I think it does matter. It does matter because ambassadors do play an important role, even if, as has been set up in this agreement, the top level work on making the relationship between the UK and the EU as we go forward will be carried out in the Partnership Council and in various other bodies with political leadership and ministerial leadership. Those meetings need to be prepared and they need to be followed up. And you need to set up a network of different frameworks for dialogue and working together. And you need, therefore, ambassadors, both in London and in Brussels, to be able to do their jobs and to make all of that work. So anything that gets in the way of that, I think, is very unwelcome. Now, some have commented that, I think you just made the point, the British government seems to be saying, well, we want to make a statement about how we regard the European Union. Well, I guess you could argue that they made that statement in following up the outcome of the referendum vote and in negotiating the terms of departure and in setting out the terms of the agreement on the future relationship. They've kind of made the point about their view of the relationship they're going to have with the European Union in future. So I hope that having done that, it's going to be possible to find a way of getting over this bump in the road, because if not, it does pose problems. As you'll remember, the Trump administration for a while downgraded the status of the EU ambassador in Washington. And what happened in Brussels was that the Trump's representative, the US ambassador to the EU, was basically frozen out of contact with the institutions for quite a long time. I don't think that's productive either way. So I hope we're going to be able to get beyond this quickly.
Yeah. By the way, I should add to our viewers that we welcome questions, and please use the chat function to pose any that you have. So, Julian, we have this situation where the UK is trying to find its new sort of role in the world. The EU is also figuring out how to position itself in an era of great power competition. In one sense, there's rivalry between London and Brussels and other European capitals, but in another sense, they do have a lot of common ground. From the Iran nuclear deal to climate. I mean, what do you think is the way to harness that and find a way in which, whatever the ideological differences, the EU and the UK can work together on this large common agenda that they have in a reasonably harmonious way?
Well, I agree that's the challenge. And I think there is, maybe a slightly old-fashioned way of describing things, but I think there is a sort of great power triangle that conditions the scope for international cooperation on security issues at the moment, with the US and China and the EU in different ways, trying to stake out ground and work out how they're going to relate one to another. And the UK has now got to find a way of navigating its way through that triangle. And it needs to make sure that it's not a Bermuda Triangle in which it gets lost. It needs to be able to find ways of cooperating where it shares objectives, as you've said, and also distinguishing and giving a lead in some areas. I think the big important meetings for the next year do give a platform for that. But as far as its relationship, the UK's relationship with the EU goes, I sincerely hope that it's going to be able to overcome any reservations it has about the political nature of that relationship in order to focus on practical areas of cooperation. When it's on terrorism, cybersecurity, a whole range of new security threats, it does have an institutional framework for doing that now. And might want to talk a little bit about how you can make that work. In other areas, it's going to have to be driven by policies. But on climate, the overlap between the objectives that the HMG, the UK government, has set out so far, and the objectives that the EU and the 27 member states have set out, it is very significant. So they should be finding ways of working together. When it comes to relationships with the other corners of the triangle, if you like, obviously with the United States, the European Union has signaled that it wants to engage with the new administration, but it wants to engage on its own terms. And I think you can interpret some of the recent steps by the European Union in that light. So it's sought to indicate that on China, it's going to also have its views and its interests. Now, you can argue the merits of this latest EU agreement with China on investment, but it's a statement also that it has interests. It's obviously been staking out some ground, which is sometimes in shorthand referred to as a sort of strategic autonomy. But in practice, the latest manifestation of that is a statement about ambitions for the international role of the euro, a certain amount of measures to reinforce capital markets, and also attitudes to sanctions, including reactions to US extraterritorial sanctions. And the UK is going to have to find a position in light of what the EU is doing in terms of its engagement with the new administration to navigate those relations successfully.
Yeah, and I wonder if we could just turn perhaps as a sort of example of this evolving relationship to the pandemic, and particularly the row over vaccines between the EU and AstraZeneca, which in some ways is quite illustrative, because you're seeing commentary in the UK saying, well, this shows, that the UK was at an advantage because it was not in the EU scheme or indeed the EU, and therefore it was able to move quickly and make the decisions needed to get the supplies early, and now we're reaping the benefit. Now, do you think that is true? And even if it is it wise and indeed helpful to be saying things like that?
Well, I mean, you have to be realistic. Obviously, emotions are running high around these issues, which, as you said in your introduction, might not be traditional security issues, but they're certainly issues of life and death. So it's not surprising that people take very strong views on this. I think what's happening, if you take half a step back, and some of the commentary, including in the FT, but elsewhere as well, there's a particularly good piece in a rival publication, Politico, this morning. What's happening on the EU side is that they attach a lot of importance to solidarity, and they're paying perhaps a certain price in practice for how that has worked out. So they wanted to move collectively because they wanted to avoid a sort of beggar thy neighbor approach to procurement of vaccines, and I think you can understand that. They wanted to look at cost, and they put into the negotiations some quite hard-nosed trade negotiators who drove costs down in discussions, but that, it also seems, has some consequences. and they probably prioritized a certain amount of process and a characteristically prudent approach, including to the kind of exposure that they wanted to guard against. So liabilities were written into contracts, things like that, which again have had some consequences. So it wasn't, it wasn't warp speed, to coin a phrase. If you think about your Star Trek approach, they prioritize results, not process. So there are some characteristics of the way the EU works that you can detect in this story, and the UK has been more nimble. I think that is widely recognised. So there is some trade-off here between nimbleness and solidarity. But that said, not just across Europe, so the EU and the UK, but also much more widely, this is a story where it is win-win or lose-lose. Eventually, people need to get vaccinated sooner rather than later. And so, I hope it's going to be possible to find a way of getting over some of the current difficulties in order to continue to cooperate so that people in the UK can get vaccinated, people across the EU can get vaccinated, and together, as wealthy countries, leading international efforts on this through COVAX and the other frameworks that have been set up, we collectively can give a lead and support to spreading vaccines to other parts of the world, because otherwise we're all going to be at risk, because it's only when this pandemic is rolled back in other parts of the world that we're actually going to be able to return to the kind of lives that we remember, including, properly open borders and freedom of travel.
You raised the possibility of, and God forbid, let's hope this doesn't happen, a lose-lose outcome. That perhaps leads us on to the subject of internal security, in that there is a situation where it seems pretty clear that there has been a lose-lose outcome. The UK has withdrawn through Brexit from various structures of cooperation. It's dropped out of the SIS2 criminal database and the European arrest warrant and so forth. Clearly this is damaging to both sides. You had direct view of the security portfolio during your time as a European Commissioner. How worried should we be about what has been lost in the security relationship, and how quickly and effectively do you think at least some of that can be rebuilt?
So you were writing about this earlier this week, and you quoted somebody else saying that this was lose-lose. I think that is possibly a slightly negative way of describing where we ended up, because I think it could have been much worse. It wasn't a given that we were going to get agreement on internal security cooperation. We did get an agreement between the UK and the EU, and it's an important part of the agreement on the future relationship. And I think that's very welcome, because if that hadn't happened, then various forms of cooperation built up over the years, over the last decade, were going to be turned off overnight. And I think that would have done nobody any good. So that's the lose situation that we avoided. But what we have got was perhaps inevitably damage limitation, because you were departing from the integrated relationship amongst member states that have been built up over, as I say, a decade, because the UK was leaving the European Union and was going to cease to be a member state and become a third country. That was the inevitable consequence. But that said, the arrangements that have been reached have saved quite a lot of the cooperation. So they've saved a relationship between the UK outside the EU and the major EU law enforcement and justice agencies, Europol, Eurojust, and that's very good. Those who are on the front line, the practitioners, always emphasize the benefits of those agencies and the cooperation that they promote. It has saved some of the legal frameworks for cooperation in this area. One that is widely known was about returning people who were wanted for various serious crimes. Amongst EU member states, that's called the European Arrest Warrant. Now there's a version of that has been saved in the relationship between the UK outside and the EU in a surrender agreement. And I think that's very important. And it's saved some of the network of information sharing databases that have become so crucial to cooperation in this field against the whole range of crimes, cyber, serious, but also against serious threats like terrorism. So you pick out one, and it's an important one, the Schengen Information System, that it will not continue to work between the UK and the EU, but there are others for sharing information around DNA, crime scene forensics, fingerprints, sharing information on people who are coming in and out of our airports, sharing information about criminal records. There are others that have been maintained in one form or another. There is a gap, and it's important. The Schengen Information System was used, as you know, billions of times. That's billions with a B amongst the EU member states each year to check in real time information about persons of interest, people you wanted to issue an alert around, either because they were of interest in relation to serious crime or, very serious, if they were suspected of involvement in terrorist activity. So the UK is no longer part of that. And there needs to be an effort to try and plug that gap. And I welcome the fact that that's been clearly identified as a problem, and that the British government have said that they are going to try and address it in various ways. There's work to do.
Yes, so I'd like to adapt a question that we received on SIS2 from the Schengen Information System from Dirk Hazel, leader of UK EPP, who says, does Sir Julian predict any difficulty or delay on the EU side if a future British government were to seek to restore real-time access to SIS2? Now, the context, of course, as you well know, is that on the EU side, there's a lot of skepticism about whether the ECJ would ever allow such a restoration, because it would not be seen as proportionate. But how do you see it? I mean, is there any prospect that the UK could come back in one day, or some kind of hybrid form where it doesn't come back in fully, but there's a bigger arrangement than there is today?
So the first thing to say, of course, is that one of the outstanding issues that affects cooperation across this area, still as yet unresolved, is whether the EU is going to grant the UK data adequacy. That is, agree that personal data continues to flow between the EU and the UK. Now, that goes much wider than security. It has wide economic implications, but it also directly relates to this kind of information sharing on security. And I hope that's going to, I'm pretty confident that that's going to happen. I don't see why it shouldn't happen. The UK it operates the data protection rules, the GDPR, as effectively as any other EU member state. And in my view, I may be biased, but in my view, the oversight arrangements, the transparency and oversight arrangements for the activities of the security and intelligence agencies in the UK is at least as good as those arrangements that exist in other European countries, EU member states. So I don't see any reason why you shouldn't get adequacy. But it's open to challenge. So it is a source of potential instability in future cooperation in this area. The UK is trying to plug this gap, as you know, by greater cooperation across Interpol databases, and I welcome that. But it's not the same as cooperation amongst very like-minded countries, your European neighbours, because you're cooperating with the world, 194 members of Interpol, and some of them, to put it politely, don't necessarily have the same approach to fighting crime or terrorism. So sharing information across that wider net is a challenge. The UK also wants to build up.
Just to be explicit, the problem with Interpol is political abuse of the system, isn't it?
So
by some authoritarian.
These alerts, which we're talking about, people of interest, as you know, historically there's been some debate about how some countries who are in Interpol use those. There's been charges that Russia has used them incorrectly. There are questions about how China processes some of this information. So yes, it's a bigger challenge. Which is why I think the UK has also said that it wants to build up using new technology, a way of cooperating between like-minded and trusted countries on these kind of alerts. And they want to bring in, Five Eyes countries as well to that kind of cooperation. I think that's great, but it's going to take some time to build up. What they do want to do is preserve some cooperation with European neighbours. So they're particularly engaging with European members of the EU to try and get them to share the kind of alerts that are shared over the Schengen information system through the Interpol database. And I hope that works. If at some point in the future, the UK wanted to reach out and say, look, EU, can't we think about this again? Can't we find some way of linking into this framework of cooperation that's been established under Schengen? Personally, I would welcome that. And from the EU side, I said this when I was when I was inside the Commission, I think that there's time now to have a fresh look at how they can reach a hand out, not just to the UK, but to other countries as well, to see whether there isn't some way of increasing cooperation around this kind of very important information sharing. Perhaps the Brexit negotiations were not the best framework for that kind of creative new thinking, but that's done now. We have the agreement.
Yeah.
Let's move on and see whether the EU can't think again about creative ways of cooperating with a whole range of like-minded countries who want to strengthen their work, particularly against terrorism, but also against serious and cybercrime.
So I've got a question which perhaps puts things in a more negative light from Sandra Khadouri, project founder of Keeping Channels Open, who says the UK government has made us less safe by pushing through the Brexit project and deliberately undermining security cooperation and resilience. Why did so many influential people in the UK security services and defence give the green light to Brexit?
Well, I don't speak for the security authorities in the UK, but I'm not sure that they would see it that they gave a green light for Brexit. There was a referendum. The government said in the light of the referendum that they were going to pursue their departure from the European Union. And as we said right at the beginning, different governments interpreted that in different ways, and we've reached the agreement that we've reached. The security authorities across Europe actually have very close cooperation, and that continues. So, as you know, the intelligence services across Europe have built up cooperation over recent years. They even now have shared platforms where they come together, each owning their own information, but to work together, sharing that information to try and combat particularly terrorism. And that continues outside the EU framework. And there are very strong bilateral relations as well. All of those continue, and they're very valuable, but they take place within a wider framework of information sharing between law enforcement, police, border guards, immigration officers. And that's what we're talking about with things like the Schengen information system. Can you embed the continuing good intelligence cooperation within a wider framework of very useful real-time information sharing, particularly about movements of people, in a way that people feel confidence in, because it is amongst like-minded countries who share the same basic values, share the same approach to rule of law.
So I have another question here, which perhaps relates to some of the themes we talked about with respect to vaccines earlier, from Zale Johnson, NCP Global Innovation Lead at Security Innovate UK, who asks, do you think that Brexit has given the government, the UK government, an opportunity to boost funding in defence and security in terms of R&D and innovation? And do you think that this would have been possible, would have happened if the UK hadn't left the EU? In other words, has this created opportunities for such investments?
So, as I understand it, the government, the UK government, is as part of its look at the future of defence, and as you know, there's going to be a review of that coming out shortly. It is looking to reinforce R&D spend, to arrest the secular decline in defence R&D spend, and I think that's very positive. I don't think it's that they've taken money, as it were, somehow generated by leaving the EU and put that into defence, but it is a part of a wider review that the British government is doing about how defence can be part of the UK playing an active role in the world. So I think that you'll find on a number of issues that the UK wants to be, on defence issues, a little bit more French, ironically. So I think you'll find that it wants to invest in R&D, that it wants to promote British defence R&D and defence industry, that it wants to support that as part of its global efforts to export and have partnerships with a range of countries around the world, some already existing, some new partnerships, and that it wants to be quite active in projecting defence, British defence, as part of British engagement in the world. So I think that will happen. The details, I think, are still being worked out, and we'll see the framework for that in this integrated review later this spring.
I mean, one theme since Brexit has been the UK talking very much about the importance of NATO and its own role in it. Do you think that is potentially going to create any frictions with the EU on security cooperation? And I know there are EU members who are not in NATO, and conversely other NATO members who are not in the EU. So the two don't map exactly even before Brexit. But do you see that the UK is very heavily focusing on NATO in that way as creating any difficulties in the evolving security relationship with the EU?
Well, the first thing to say, and you know, we've discussed this before, is that I think the nature of the relationship between independently of the UK, the nature of the relationship between the EU and NATO has changed significantly over recent years. I mean, small but illustrative story. When I was last in the Commission, so 12 years ago, the two ends of town in Brussels hardly talked. The EU did its thing, NATO likewise. When I came back this time, admittedly I was working on security, but one of the very first people to phone up and reach out when I arrived was a very senior person in NATO. That wouldn't have happened 10 years before. So the relationship between EU and NATO has significantly improved. I'd like to give a plug here to Federica Mogherini, who I think did a lot to try and remove some of the difficulties to that relationship. Not all of them, obviously, but remove some of the difficulties to that relationship and make the cooperation better. Partly, that is a reflection of, as we were saying right at the beginning, an increased role for the EU as a security actor. So on terrorism, cyber, NATO, securing critical digital infrastructure, NATO recognized that the EU could make a very positive contribution, that it was a valid security actor on a range of issues. And so the two sides were able to have, you know, if you like, a slightly more open conversation about those things. Now, I don't think the the change in the UK's relationship with the EU need upset that. Indeed, in some respects, I hope that it can contribute to that conversation, because certainly the UK is going to want NATO to be playing a role on terrorism, cyber, securing critical digital infrastructure. And that role means working with the EU. That said, there will still be some difficulties. There are some countries who pose difficulties, we know that, and there are some issues that are going to pose difficulties. And it goes back to your last question about defence R&D and defence projects. The EU has created, through the European Defence Fund, some new rules, which look quite a lot like the American rules, around how defence project cooperation is going to work in future. And I hope that those don't become a new source of friction between those countries in NATO who are in the EU and those in NATO who are not. And I think we need to watch that and guard against it.
I mean, we've only got a few minutes left, and I've got a last question from a viewer, and then I just wanted to close off with a final question to you about the future. So Ewan Grant, a former intelligence analyst for transitional organized crime in ex-Soviet states at HM Customs and Excise, says, which particular type of security and law enforcement issues outside of terrorism do you see cooperation working well at the moment, and which areas do you think it could be improved in? And he refers to the case of the Vietnamese trafficking victims as a kind of cross-border case that perhaps sort of deserves a closer look for the lessons it's taught.
Yeah. I agree. The trafficking issues are an area where we should definitely continue close cooperation. That's why I mentioned the agencies, because I think the EU agencies have a role to play there. There's a whole raft of online criminal activity where, frankly, there aren't borders. People who are trying to do this don't make a distinction between whether you're in or out of the European Union. So I hope that we're going to be able to maintain very close cooperation on those issues as well. There's a whole lot of sort of money laundering. You've written about all of this. There's a whole lot of money laundering activities where I'm glad that the agreement that's been reached between the UK and the EU does recognize that that's an area where we need to keep working. I hope that doesn't become, that shouldn't be an area where we diverge. It's an area where we should be able to work together. And then wider cyber.
That fits in with the Biden focus on kleptocracy, right? Potentially.
Indeed. And the wider area of cyber, the misuse of cyber. So not just by criminal gangs, but related to state actors as well. I think that there's a short chapter in the agreement on future cooperation between the UK and the EU on that. I hope that that's one of the areas where we're talking about a platform, a floor for that cooperation that we're gonna build upon, because the UK has some real expertise in this field. The EU has been developing its effort in this field, and we should definitely work together.
Time has run out, Julian. So final question about the future. There are many possible futures to the EU-UK security relationship, but perhaps I can present two to you. One is that after the kind of tensions of Brexit, the maximalist approach to sovereignty taken by the UK government, that things settle down to something more pragmatic, where both sides sort of quietly recognise what their core interests are and adapt accordingly. The sort of darker version of the future is that so many political tensions have broken out already, that there are these great power rivalries, and each side, and the EU-UK side, will cut deals with different actors, and the relationship will tend to diverge and be characterized by suspicion and a lack of cooperation. Which of those, if either, do you see as more likely?
Well, I mean, it would surprise you. I think we should aspire to the former, but we need to be realistic.
Which is more likely, yes.
We need to be realistic, because some of the things you describe in the second scenario, are not impossible. So I think that because on security, the whole range of security issues, all the way from crime to defense, we have shared interests, and we have a mutual self-interest in being able to cooperate effectively. I hope that people will remember that, and they will remain attached to that, and they will resist the temptation to let, I think, probably inevitable difficulties and squalls in the wider relationship infect the security pillar of the relationship. Now, that may be a pious hope, but I think that is it's not unrealistic to set that out as an objective, and then to say that is the objective that we should try and pursue, recognizing that the wider relationship is going to be bumpy. There are adjustments now, there are unresolved issues, and there will be wider reviews, political pressures around that relationship. But don't let us ignore that, but it shouldn't blow us off course on security cooperation.
On that semi-optimistic note, at least, thank you very much, Sir Julian King, for a fascinating discussion. And thank you very much to everybody who has watched and asked questions. And I look forward to the next event, and I wish everybody a very good day. Thank you very much.
Thanks. Bye.